Hello, my lovelies. My name's Gilbert Dolthalion, and the plan for today is to talk about fabric grain. This isn't a technique, but a core piece of information that will help you when you're shopping for fabric, when you're placing a pattern, or when you're drafting. When you know how to identify the grain in your fabrics, you can take advantage of it for a perfect fit, while avoiding sagging or baggy hems. Think of the grain as a line across your fabric that will tell you how it will behave when you cut it. You don't need anything to identify it aside from the knowledge, so let's get to that. Fabric comes in two main types, knit and weave. And weave is what you're thinking of when you think of a loom. Threads are woven in and out of one another to make the fabric. The grain of the fabric is simply referring to these threads and which direction they're going in. The crosswise or cross grain is parallel to the horizontal thread, going selvage to selvage, which is the finished edge on the sides of your fabric. The lengthwise or straight grain is parallel to your selvage, and this is the grain that patterns will want you to line up most of the time. On woven fabric, you can find the cross grain either by ripping the fabric, or by finding a yarn and pulling it and using that to cut your straight line. Knit fabric is created through combining loops of fabric, giving a stretchier fabric. You can identify knit fabric by looking for the ribs, which are formed by the loops on the crosswise grain. While technically the term grain only applies to woven fabrics, it's still used for knit fabrics when patterning, so you will still need to be able to find it. In the case of knit fabrics, the grain isn't caused by the individual threads but by the loops, and there is still a crosswise and a straight grain, although crosswise loops are technically called courses. On knit fabric, the best way to identify the grain is to use the ribs, which will follow the grain line. Aside from the straight and cross grain, there's also the bias grain, which is any time you go diagonally across the fabric. A true bias is at a 45-degree angle to the other two grains, but occasionally patterns will have you cutting across them at various other angles, which are also across the bias. The thing to be aware of when cutting on the bias is that it's much less stable than other cuts and is prone to bagging or sagging. This is why when you cut large pieces on the bias, such as skirt pieces, you should hang them before hemming. They will lose their shape, and it's best practice to allow for that, let it happen, and then recut them so that it doesn't happen over the life of the garment. There's also an advantage to cutting across the bias. It has a degree of flexibility and stretchiness even on non-stretch fabrics. This is why it's used on form-fitting garments like hose. The big disadvantage to cutting on the bias, and the reason why it was avoided historically, is that it can be extremely wasteful of fabric, especially when cutting on the true bias. On modern pattern pieces, the grain that you should cut against is indicated by a line, and often labelled like on these ones, and they should have accounted for placing the pattern pieces on the correct grain in the fabric estimate. When placing your pattern pieces, you should take care to make sure that this lines up correctly, so that the fabric behaves in the way that the pattern expects. I went through and found my oldest pattern, which is from the mid-80s, which has it marked exactly the same way. True vintage patterns that are perforated rather than having printed marks usually have the grain line marked with two large perforations in a parallel line. And that's fabric grain. Just be aware that fabrics can get misaligned after the manufacturing process, so if you're struggling, that may be the issue. There are methods to realign them, but I want to keep this video short and sweet, so I will be covering them another time. Let me know if there's anything that you'd like me to cover in the future, and if you found this enjoyable or useful, please think about giving me a like and subscribing if you're not already for more sewing and costume related content. A massive thank you to all of my followers and anyone who made it this far through the video. Thank you so much. Stay safe, stay sensible, and I shall see you soon. Bye!